I was sitting at the foot of a hospital bed in Recife when Ezekias Drummond Cavalcante finally let go. He was 95 years old. His hands, which had once split sugar cane stalks with the casual efficiency of a man who had made peace with hard labor, lay flat against the white sheet like two weathered maps of a continent nobody had bothered to name yet. His breathing had been slowing for 3 days. I had driven 400 kilometers because his granddaughter, Sulamita, had called me at 2 in the morning and said, "He's asking for you, not his pastor, not the priest. He's asking for you." I didn't know why. I hadn't spoken to Ezekias in 11 years. But I came. His room smelled of camphor and old rain. There was a single window, and through it the city of Recife sprawled outward in that swampy, relentless way it has. Half colonial architecture, half improvised survival. The kind of city that never quite decided whether it was dignified or desperate, and eventually chose both. A ceiling fan turned slowly above us, stirring the heat without defeating it. "You came," Ezekias said. His voice was thin but unhurried, like water finding its way through limestone. "You asked," I said. He turned his head toward me. His eyes were still extraordinary, the color of amber left too long in the sun, gone nearly translucent, ringed with something that looked like permanent knowing. The man had never been educated past the 4th grade, and had spent 40 years reading every book he could find in 3 languages. He used to say that school was where they sent children to forget what they already understood. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before I go and can no longer be called a liar for saying it." I pulled a chair close. Outside, a bus rumbled past on the street below. Sulamita hovered in the doorway for a moment, then disappeared without a word, as though she understood that whatever was about to happen required a specific kind of privacy. "I was 19 years old," Ezekias began. "My mother was dying too, though differently. She was dying the way poor women died in the Zona da Mata in 1947, which is to say, slowly, and without anyone calling it anything. We had no name for what she had. We had no money for the name, even if we'd had one. And I walked 14 kilometers to a church in a town called Lagoa de Tabuleiros, because I had heard there was a man there who healed people." He paused. The ceiling fan clicked once on every revolution, a small, faithful metronome. There was no man who healed people. There was only an old Pentecostal preacher named Osvaldo Tancredi, who wore a white suit and spoke Portuguese with an Italian accent, and who told me, after I begged him for 3 hours, that my mother was sick because she carried the curse of Ham. I said nothing. "You know the story," Ezekias said. It wasn't a question. I knew the story. Everyone raised in a certain tradition knows the story. Noah, drunk and uncovered in his tent. Ham, who sees his father's nakedness and does not cover him, but goes to tell his brothers. Noah waking, cursing Canaan, decreeing that Ham's descendants shall be servants of servants. The story that for several centuries, certain men of certain convictions used as a theological crowbar to prop open the doors of slavery, of colonialism, of every variety of human diminishment dressed in Scripture. Osvaldo Tancredi told me my mother deserved what she was suffering, Ezekias said. He told me the black body was a body under divine judgment. He said it with great tenderness. That was the worst part. He seemed genuinely sad about it, as if God had made a difficult but correct decision, and we should all learn to accept it with grace. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something had shifted. Not grief exactly, but a rearrangement of grief, the way a man looks when he has been carrying a stone for so long that setting it down feels dangerous. I walked 14 kilometers back. My mother died 4 days later. And for the next 30 years, I hated God with a precision I have never managed to apply to anything else in my life. And then? I asked. And then I was 49 years old, sitting under a mango tree near Palmares, and I had what I can only describe as a conversation. He said the word conversation the way a man says a word he has spent decades testing for accuracy and has never quite been satisfied with but has no better option for. With Jesus? I asked. Ezekias turned his amber eyes to me again. With something I can only call Jesus because I have no other word for what it was. You understand that when I say this, I am not speaking metaphorically. I am also not speaking the way Osvaldo Tancredi spoke, with that terrible, tender certainty. I am speaking the way a man speaks about something that happened to him that he cannot prove and cannot deny. I understand, I said, and sitting at the foot of that hospital bed, with the ceiling fan marking time and the city groaning outside, I did understand. I had my own mango tree. Everyone who has lived with enough attention has their own mango tree. He showed me something, Ezekias said, or perhaps I should say, I was shown something, and I understood it as being shown by him. There is a difference. The first is about a person with an agenda. The second is about a truth that simply arrives. He shifted in the bed. Sulamita appeared briefly in the doorway again with a glass of water, set it on the nightstand, and vanished again like a careful ghost. What was shown to you? I asked. Ezekias was quiet for a long moment. The bus outside had been replaced by rain, a sudden tropical hammering on the window that arrived with no warning, as rain always did in Recife. I was shown the story of Ham, he said finally, not Osvaldo Tancredi's version, the true story, and it is hard to accept, not because it is terrible, because it is enormous, because it requires you to unlearn something that was built into you like a load-bearing wall, and when you remove it, you have to be willing to stand in the rubble for a while before you can build anything new. I leaned forward. Osvaldo Tancredi's version was a lie dressed in the language of Scripture, Ezekias said. The curse of Ham, as those men taught it, did not exist. Let me be very precise about this. Noah cursed Canaan, not Ham, not Ham's children broadly, not Africans, not black people. Canaan, a specific grandson in the context of a specific dispute in a specific ancient Near Eastern tribal conflict. And even that limited, specific, historically situated pronouncement was Noah speaking, a man who had just been drunk and naked and humiliated, not God speaking, a man. He said this without heed. That was the remarkable thing. 30 years of precision-honed hatred, and when he finally arrived at the correction, it came out with the composure of someone reading coordinates. But what I was shown, he continued, was not merely the correction of a lie. Any scholar can correct a lie. What I was shown was something underneath the lie. The reason the lie was so effective. The reason men like Osvaldo Tancredi could say it with such tenderness and be believed. The rain intensified, a crack of thunder somewhere over the Capibaribe River. "And what was that?" I asked. Ezekias looked at the ceiling for a moment, as though reading something written there in water stains and old paint. "The truth about black people is not a curse," he said. "It is a calling. And the calling is so specific, so historically verifiable, so woven into the fiber of recorded human civilization, that the only way to neutralize it was to invert it, to take the people who had carried the oldest knowledge of God on the planet and convince them and everyone around them that they were furthest from it." He paused. "Ethiopia is the first nation named in Genesis outside of Eden," he said, "not as a footnote, as a landmark. The river Gihon compasses the whole land of Cush, the whole land. Before Israel was a nation, before Rome was a dream, before Greece had written a single letter of its alphabet, the Cushite civilization, which is to say, the African civilization of the Nile's headwaters, was already ancient, already theologically sophisticated, already in conversation with the divine in ways that the later Abrahamic traditions would inherit, transform, and in many cases obscure. I had read enough to follow him. The Cushites, the Nubians, the Kemetic traditions, the scholars who had spent careers documenting the theological and architectural and philosophical inheritance that flowed northward through the ancient world like the Nile itself, depositing rich sediment wherever it touched. This was not fringe scholarship. It was uncomfortable scholarship, which is a different thing. "Moses," Ezekias said, "Moses married a Cushite woman, and when Miriam complained about it, when Miriam, who was herself a prophetess, allowed her objection to her brother's wife to be an objection to the woman's origin, she was struck with leprosy. By God, not by Moses, by God. The man who translated divine law for an entire civilization had a black wife, and God made the consequence of objecting to her very clear." He turned his head toward the window where the rain was now sliding down the glass in thick, indistinct sheets. "The Queen of Sheba," he said, "who came to Solomon not to be taught, but to test him, who came already possessing wisdom of such magnitude that the only person she considered worth her intellectual time was the man described as the wisest who had ever lived. And even then, the text records that Solomon gave her everything she desired. The exchange was not tribute, it was reciprocal. The wisest king in Jewish tradition and the queen of an African nation met as equals. The thunder again, closer. "Simon of Cyrene," Ezekias said, and his voice shifted almost imperceptibly, carrying now some frequency I could feel in my sternum. When Jesus could no longer carry the cross, when the weight of what he was carrying broke him physically, the Romans chose a man from Cyrene, North Africa, a man whose sons, Mark records, were known to the early Christian community, Alexander and Rufus. Named, not anonymous, known. At the moment of maximum consequence, at the literal pivot point of what Christians call salvation history, an African man's shoulders carried what the Christ could not. He stopped. Outside, the rain began slowly to relent, as though it too had been listening and understood when to be quiet. What I was shown under that mango tree, Ezekiel said, was not flattery. It was not replacement mythology, not the simple inversion of Osvaldo Tancredi's lie, where you take the curse and make it a crown. Those inversions are satisfying for about 10 years, and then they become their own kind of prison. What I was shown was something harder and cleaner than that. What was it? I asked. That the oldest spiritual knowledge on earth was guarded by people who were later enslaved. That the people who were later enslaved were enslaved specifically because their knowledge, their organizing capacity, their theological and agricultural and mathematical sophistication made them threatening. That the curse of Ham was not a description of divine judgment, but a psychological operation, perhaps the longest-running psychological operation in human history, designed to make a people believe that the very thing that made them remarkable was the thing that condemned them. He reached out and touched my wrist. His hand was very light, very dry. "Do you understand why that is hard to accept?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. "Because if it's true," I said slowly, "then the response can't be rage, and it can't be grief. It has to be something more demanding than either of those." Ezekiel almost smiled. It was the first time his face had moved in that direction since I'd arrived. "Responsibility," he said. "That's the word that came to me under that mango tree and never left. Not pride, not vindication, responsibility. If you have been carrying the oldest knowledge and have been systematically convinced that you are carrying a curse, then recovery is not a feeling. It is a practice. It is daily. It is unremarkable most of the time. It is the kind of work that doesn't trend." He settled back against his pillow. The rain had stopped entirely. The ceiling fan clicked on its faithful revolution. "I went back to Lagoa de Tabuleiros once," he said, almost conversationally. "Not to find Osvaldo Tancredi. He'd been dead for 20 years by then. But to walk the road I'd walked at 19, in the other direction. 14 kilometers. I wanted to walk it as a man who knew what he was, not as a boy who had been told what he wasn't." "What was it like?" I asked. "Long," he said, "very long, and completely worth it." We sat together for a while after that. The city resumed its ordinary sounds outside. Vendors, motorbikes, a radio somewhere playing something with a bass that you felt in your teeth. Sulamita came in and adjusted his pillow. She looked at me with the tentacular expression of a woman who has learned to read rooms the way her grandfather read books, which is to say, with total attention and without urgency. Ezekiel died 3 days later. Peacefully, Sulamita told me on the phone, in the early morning, when the light in Recife is that specific pale gold that makes the whole city look like it's remembering something. At the funeral, his pastor, a young man named Fabricio, who wore glasses and spoke with the careful diction of someone who had earned his authority through study rather than inheritance, read from Zephaniah. The 3rd chapter, the passage about the daughter of Ethiopia who would bring offerings, about the dispersed people who would be gathered, about shame being transformed not by denial but by homecoming. I stood in the back. I was not a member of that congregation. I had no claim to that grief, except the particular claim of having been trusted once at the end with something that a man had carried for 76 years and needed to put down before he left. Walking out into the sun afterward, I thought about Osvaldo Tancredi in his white suit, speaking tenderness like a weapon. I thought about 14 kilometers of cane fields and dust. I thought about mango trees and what arrives under them when a man is finally still enough to receive it. I thought about Simon of Cyrene's shoulders, about the Queen of Sheba testing a king, about the river Gihon compassing the whole land, unhurried, before history had learned to be in a hurry. I thought about what Ezekiel had said about responsibility, about it being daily and unremarkable, and the kind of work that doesn't trend. I thought, there are people walking around right now carrying what they were told was a curse. And somewhere in that weight, in the very density of it, in the way it has survived every attempt to extinguish it, is something that was always the opposite. That is the story Ezekias Drummond Cavalcante told me 3 days before he died. It is hard to accept. He was right about that. But hard and impossible are not the same country. They only share a border. And the road between them is exactly as long as you're willing to walk. Thousands of people have already joined this community. Don't miss the next story. Subscribe now, leave a like, and tell us in the comments, what city are you listening from?